Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our monthly webinar series, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of Virtues and Vocations, a national forum that's housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame and supported by the Kern Family Foundation. I'm Suzanne Shanahan, Executive Director of the Center for Social Concerns and host of this series. Virtues and Vocations hosts conversations between scholars and practitioners across disciplines to consider how best to cultivate character and moral purpose in higher education and the professions. This webinar series is one of the ways we facilitate these conversations. Another is through a biannual magazine called Virtues and Vocations, Higher Education for Human Flourishing. This month, we're thrilled to bring these two parts of our initiative together through an extended conversation with three authors from our recently released issue on hope. The issue included essays from a set of 13 scholars from different disciplines from across the country on topics from the practical uses of hope, to hope in the Iranian women's movement, to hope in AI, to hope in racial healing. The issue also included an interview with University of Chicago professor of philosophy and author of the iconic 2006 Radical Hope, Jonathan Lear. There is a link in the chat to the online version of the magazine, as well as a link if you'd like to request a print copy. Our conversation will run till about 1 o'clock, and then we'll open it up for questions. You can submit a question anytime through the Q&A mechanism, and I'll pose them directly. And with that, I'd like to welcome our guests for today's conversation. We have with us today a doctor, a professor, and a pastor. Lydia Dugdale is a professor of medicine and director of the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at Columbia University. She is author of The Lost Art of Dying, Reviving Forgotten Wisdom, a popular press book on preparing for death, and editor of Dying in the 21st Century, Toward a New Ethical Framework for the Art of Dying Well. Brandon Vaidyanathan is associate professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the Catholic University of America. His research examines the role of culture in religious, economic, and scientific institutions, and is author of Mercenaries and Missionaries, Capitalism and Catholicism in the Global South, and co-author of Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. Brandon is also co-founder of Beauty at Work, a content platform which includes a podcast and YouTube channel exploring the role of beauty in our work and in our lives. And finally, we have Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, who is a spiritual writer, preacher, and community cultivator. He serves as assistant director for partnerships and fellowships at Yale's University Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. He is author of The Awakening of Hope, Why We Practice Common Faith, amongst many other books and articles. He lives with his family at Ripa House, a hospitality house in Durham, North Carolina. Welcome, y'all. So glad to have you here. What I'm hoping, as we discussed before, is to have a fairly open-ended conversation to understand how you came to this particular way of thinking at Hope. And to start that, I would really love for each of you, maybe starting with Lydia, to reflect upon your own journey to this articulation of hope. How did you arrive at your current vocation? And how did that inspire this particular notion of hope? Just so folks can get a little bit of a taste of your own work and what animates it. So maybe Lydia, and we'll turn to each person in turn. You could jump in.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's great to be here. Happy to be with Brandon and Jonathan today as well. So I'm a medical doctor. I'm a primary care doctor and mostly take care of older patients, which means often we're confronting together, sort of as allies against the disease, situations that often feel quite hopeless. We are often met with quite a lot of despair. It's hard to see a way forward. And as I've been sort of in the world of medicine for a couple of decades now, I've watched how colleagues address this despair. And on the one hand, it seems that we can be too forthright with patients, where they can only hear what is devastating, and there seems to be no space for hope. And then on the flip side, there's this false hope, which I think is probably more common in medicine. Many doctors hide behind the sort of difficult conversations. They hide from the difficult conversations by sort of pointing out whatever glimmer of hope might be possible in a particular medical situation. But this often is not really seeing the forest for the trees. And so I've struggled with this with patients. I tend to err on the side of maybe being too honest, and so thus inducing despair. And at the same time, I have a deep disdain for the kind of false hope that I see my colleagues give to patients. So I've been trying to figure out what is that middle ground. And then as a person of faith myself, who has always practiced medicine in very, very secular spaces, I've wondered how I might be able to meaningfully translate an articulation of hope for a secular patient population in a way that also isn't deceitful. Does, if, for example, the Christian tradition says, well, hope is in Christ, is there a hope that doesn't require Christ, that is still an authentic hope, that is sufficiently robust to sort of stand on its own? So that's what I kind of bring to this conversation, and I've been thinking about for the last many years.
Great. Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky journey to try to articulate in a couple of minutes, because there are a couple of different strands here. I mean, one is sort of thinking through my own the role of hope in my own personal journey as someone who's, I grew up in the Middle East, and I'm an immigrant in the United States, and I've lived in many countries, and I think there's constantly been, I think, through a lot of struggles, through a lot of trauma, trying to sort of think through how I've been able to find a sense of hope in those kinds of things, and what it amounts to for me, at least in what I touched on in this piece, is the role of beauty as the sort of hidden force that we have these surprising encounters with sources of hope throughout our lives, and we're often barely attentive to the kinds of whispers of hope that actually, I think, in very subtle ways we're able to pick up. So I think that beauty does, on a personal level, contribute to that disposition of hope. And I think also, when you look at social transformations, I'm a sociologist, and so trying to look at how social structures can be transformed, beauty plays a role there as well. And I touch on in the piece things like the visions of Martin Luther King Jr. and his confidence in a beautiful ideal that can be realized, even if not perfectly, right? And so there has to be, I think, even among those who are committed to changing social structures, and I think there is hope that we can change oppressive structures. There has to be that confidence in an ideal that is beautiful, that can animate us. And so both in subtle, unconscious, and in more conscious and intentional ways, I think beauty can shape our commitment to hope.
Great. How about you, Jonathan?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm delighted to get to participate in this conversation. If for those of you who are with us who have not read these essays, I read both of my colleagues' essays before coming on here, and it's a real joy. But my own journey to this place has been, I was raised in a faith community, a Christian Baptist faith community, and my own vocation was very much shaped by that. I was called by my little church in rural North Carolina to be a preacher when I was still a teenager, and in some ways I've continued to do that my whole life. But my own faith journey has increasingly led me to recognize that I am a practicing Christian in a world that is shaped by lots of other stories, and in a world that, according to my own story and tradition, is very unjust and needs to be changed. So all those questions Brandon was just raising about, like, well, where do you find the hope that something can change, have become critical questions for me. But also the very personal questions of how do I sustain hope when the various ways that I've tried to be about, participating in communities and movements for change seem to, at the very best, have mixed results. So So those are all very real questions. And I would just say also, one of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you, Lydia, is that on the pastoral side of things, I've often been in those same rooms where you've been as a doctor, and am very aware of the conversations that happen after the doctor leaves the room. And so, a lot of those conversations are about hope and what resources are available to us. So it's a critical question for so many of us. And I would just say, as a teacher, I teach now some at Yale Divinity School. It's very clear to me that our students and young people in general are asking this question all the time, particularly in light of the movements for social justice in this country and the question of climate change. A lot of young people, my own kids included, are saying, where is the hope when so much is obviously broken and obviously wrong? Where do we look for hope?
Mm-hmm. So, Jonathan, can you talk about just that, sort of the challenges to hope? And for you personally, right, sort of you root your argument in Christ, but how do you articulate that to others of different faith traditions, or in the absence of a faith tradition? How do you sustain hope, and how do you enable others to think about what that means to sustain hope in the face of these radical injustices that I think both you and Brandon talk about, but others, Nushin Javadi, who has a piece here on the movement in Iran, for example. How do you confront those obstacles?
Well, I like how you framed it, Lydia, the question of, there's your own faith tradition, but also the recognition that, in a space like a hospital or, the general public square or a school or wherever, we meet people from very different traditions. I think we in the West have often called that space secular, but I think of it more as a pluralistic space, right? Everybody in that space has something they're bringing to it, some story, some tradition, some, sort of set of values that inform their life. And so I'm always aware of the fact that, my own story is this peculiar story. I mean, the more I know it and know it in relation to other stories, I just acknowledge the Christian story is a peculiar story. We people who believe in Jesus, believe that there's hope even when the people who have all the power in this world put you in a grave. That's a peculiar kind of hope. Now, nevertheless, it does inform certain ways of being. And as a student of the Christian tradition, I'm aware of that. So I have tried to be a student, in the language of my tradition, a disciple of, the kinds of hope that come out of, for example, the slave church in America. I live here in Durham, North Carolina, just not too far from the old plantation that was actually the largest plantation in North Carolina at the end of the Civil War. And I'm a member of a Baptist church that is in an association of Baptist churches, the oldest congregations of which were all started in 1865, which is the year when the people who were enslaved on that plantation were able to start their own public institutions. And they founded those institutions out of a place called Horton Grove over there. It's still there, it's preserved, which is where people worshiped when they were enslaved. And sometimes I go over there in the woods and just try to listen to the place and to I think the spirits that are still present in the place, people who found a way to believe in the midst of a world that was shaped by people who called themselves Christian, but who nevertheless told them that they were property. They found a way to believe that this Jesus could make a way for them out of no way. So that's the kind of hope that I think sort of, the Christian resurrection hope makes possible. And so I lean heavily into that as a Christian. And I recognize that there are people with very different stories who come to the same kinds of conclusions and the same kind of work that I do. So I've got dear friends who are Muslim, dear friends who are, agnostic on the question of faith and not quite sure, whether there is a God, or what sort of God there is, but nevertheless, they've got a deep commitment to the moral arc of the universe. They've got a deep commitment to values like love and truth and justice, and find ways to lean into those same stories. So I'm very interested in how the practice of hope intersects when we're informed by very different stories.
Great. Lydia, could you speak a little bit about what sustains you and your hope, given the kind of work you do, right? Dealing with dying just absolutely routinely. And so for you personally, what is sustaining?
Well, it's interesting just listening to Jonathan and Brandon speak. I'm struck that, the work of medicine, I would say, is not necessarily hardest at end of life. 30 to 60% of my female patients have been sexually assaulted, right? I mean, the food deserts, the poverty. I'm in New York City, in a mostly Hispanic neighborhood. The lines at food pantries run around the block. Homelessness in New York City arguably is out of control. It sort of feels as though, the issues that my patients face, there's no end to the possibility of despairing. So it's not just end of life. I mean, in some ways, people who have thought and anticipated their mortality, that death on some level can be easier to deal with than some of these ongoing systems issues, personal issues, just pain. Actually, just yesterday, my priest was telling the story of a playground in Harlem where some children have been left, just sort of abandoned. They can't find the parents, and this is this week. So this isn't some other era when children were abandoned. This is this week. What kind of a society have we come to where parents are so desperate that they abandon their children at a playground with no other information? So, what sustains me, I mean, of course, my faith does, but I suppose when I think about this with regard to my patients and my students, I do a lot of teaching at Columbia's Medical School, and whether it's climate change or justice issues or George Floyd, the students are despairing, right? The articles on how the students are not well are sort of innumerable at this point. Everyone knows there's a mental health crisis, and so in my thinking, we actually have spent this last academic year doing a lot of reading with our students, our medical students, on hope, because it seems that we can sort of acquiesce to despair, and that benefits no one, right? There's no agency there. There's no action. Wendell Berry would say, despair is silence. Right. So there's not collaboration, there's not community. Or we say, look, we all have, different faith traditions, we all have different belief systems, but we need to sort of animate toward a better good. We need to animate toward change. We need to, come together. There needs to be some solidarity here. And so I think that's kind of the way I've been thinking over the last few years, just sort of putting my finger on the pulse, both of my patients and the issues in Harlem and New York City, but also how the students are doing, and figuring out how do we kind of agitate toward the good, and bring people on board. And I know, because I've spoken to many, small Orthodox Christians about this, there's a sense of, well, if you don't name Jesus, then what are you doing? It's not, you're not ultimately giving people hope. There's no ultimate hope there. And I don't think, what are we going to do? Let people despair? Are we going to just hang out and wallow there? I mean, that seems totally ineffective for anyone. It's just not good. And so that's where I've come around to this kind of conception of hope as a commitment towards the work of kind of realizing a good that you might not be able to articulate. It's ill-defined.
Mhm.
This is Aquinas, right? It's an ill-defined, arduous good, but we can lean into that ill-defined, arduous good, commit, make it a habit. And so that's, I don't know, Suzanne, if I'm answering your question, but that's kind of where my thoughts have been.
So you're actually leading into sort of the next question, where I wanted to take a step back and to have each of you try to articulate what hope is. And I wanted to throw out some other pieces that were cited in the volume to give you a sense. But you know, sort of this ill-defined, arduous good, I think, is one way to begin it. But two bits from the volume. One is Norman Wurzba, who's a Duke Divinity professor, and the other one is Mayo physician Victor Montori. And I want you to sort of take these as a point of departure for your own definition of hope. And I realize this is sort of a challenging task, especially challenging because sort of hope talk is absolutely everywhere. And I think people are using the same word, oftentimes thinking they're meaning the same thing, and then agreeing with one another, but actually fundamentally talking about something else. So I just want to throw these out as a point of departure. Norman says, but what if hope isn't really, or at least not fundamentally, a thing to possess? What if hope is instead a self-involving way of being that is inspired and animated by an affirmation of the goodness of this life, more a practiced way of life rooted in the conviction that life is worth cherishing, defending, and celebrating? And then Victor Montori, hope is born with a purposeful choice of taking the step toward the horizon. Hope grows as feet stride. Hope matures in the face of horizon's retreat. Hope is wishful walking. And maybe we can start with you, Brandon, to try to articulate your own way of thinking about hope.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything original about my perspective on hope. I mean, I suppose, you know, I think I quoted Joseph Pieper, who's I think drawing on Aquinas, right? So looking at hope as fundamentally as a virtue, and also, you know, grounded in St. Paul as a theological virtue, right? And the idea that this kind of virtue or disposition of reaching out towards this difficult good, you know, is grounded in a confident expectation of things that we can't see, right? So I think it has a reference to faith. But there's a lot, you know, on the natural plane. I mean, so you can talk about supernatural hope, but you can also talk about natural hope. And I think that is just, you know, part of just a natural virtue that people possess and should be cultivated. So I like these definitions because they exercise both, they emphasize the exercise of choice and agency. And I think we have some role to play in cultivating this attitude of hope, and we can choose not to. I really like the Lord of the Rings, you know, trilogy in this respect. And one of the things that comes to mind is the character Éowyn. So, you know, she's, I think, a character who exemplifies somebody who is surrounded by despair. She sees despair around her, and she makes this odd kind of choice to go into battle as a woman and disguised as a man. And there was you know, many years ago, I took a course on this, and a professor on the book, and the professor said this thing that I'd never forget. He said that, you know, what you see as the theme running through The Return of the King is this idea that in the absence of hope, duty will save you from despair. So which is an interesting kind of thing where it seems like there's no reason to hope and no possibility of hope, but you can still choose to adhere to your duty as a means out of despair. So I don't quite know philosophically and theologically how that works, but it's something that I found myself in a number of occasions in my life feeling like there was really no hope, no possibility of redemption in a particular situation, or no resolution to a particular problem. And yet it was possible for me to see there is a duty that I can exercise here and act out of obedience to something. And that is, I think, a kind of hope as well. Even if it's not something you see, you're still acting in a way that strengthens your reaching out towards that difficult good. And then you come out on the other side, you can start to see, right? So it's possible to act in the absence of seeing. And I think there is a certain kind of hope there. But I'll leave it all to you all to correct me if
That's
that
great.
doesn't count as so.
Yeah, I love that notion of duty. Jonathan, how about you?
Well, to pick on what you're saying, I mean, it seems like duty is a way of naming what we sometimes call keep showing up, but that always gets defined by the community that you're in, right?
Mm.
So you don't have duty or expectations absent from some group of people who are sort of expecting things of you. So I think in terms of cultivating hope, it's really important to cultivate some community that's lifting up common goods. And just to reference back to the question about, among so many young folks today, of what hope is, I think this is a real pressing question of I mean, I get confused with the letters that go with generations right now, but anyway, with with young people like my kids and people who are in college right now, whatever we call them, I notice that there's a sort of redefinition of community that's happening among them. I live in the church world. There's all sorts of evidence in the church world that churches, as we have known them, particularly in their like 20th century version, are not working for lots of people. There's a lot of sort of post-pandemic research that says people aren't coming back to the churches. Be that as it may, the interesting thing to me is what sorts of communities are people finding themselves drawn to, and what kind of vision of hope or vision of the good do those communities inspire. And there was one other study that came out last year that I thought was fascinating in this regard. It was just asking people when in the last year, and this is people under 25, when in the last year have you essentially had a religious experience? And I think they gave them some options in terms of like what sort of things they were doing. What was interesting is that I think over half of the people in the survey said they had had a religious experience while engaged in some sort of public protest, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of community, I mean, I think in the post George Floyd, post 2020 reality, there's a kind of community that people found in connecting with others out in public, asking for the systems of our common life to be other than what they are. So I think as a movement builder and community builder, I'm interested in the way that hope is connected to the kinds of community that we're building, and I think there are new expressions of that are worth paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. Lydia, did you want to add anything here? I know you talked about it in your previous comment.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just kind of coming off of what Jonathan just said, thinking about the way Aquinas says that we can hope for one another, right? So that individuals in community can hope when perhaps I might not be able to hope. There's that piece. And then I'm just thinking about the Wiersbe quotation that you gave, Suzanne. He used both the language of way of being and then a practiced way of life. And I think this just sort of harkens back to the idea of hope as a virtue, to Brandon's point, something that we have to practice. We have to make a habit. It does take work. So just sort of underscoring, kind of pulling some of these threads together.
Great. Now I want to talk to each of you about a particular section in these really tremendous articles. And I want to start with you, Brandon. And I've got the volume here, and I'm just going to read a little passage. You mentioned this notion of whispers, and this is the passage that I just find just a beautiful section. When you talk about whether in the fleeting splendor of cherry blossoms, the unexpected delight we can encounter in simple foods, the vibrant hues of renewed cityscapes, the poignant melodies resonating even through war-torn ruins, or in the sacred harmony of spirituals born from pain. Beauty stands as a testament to the resilience of hope. It whispers a promise of life's inherent values. It calls out of ourselves, inviting us to recognize the potential for transformation, even in the face of adversity. Rooting us in hope, beauty stirs within us a yearning for harmony, for justice, compelling us to reconcile the discord between the world as it is and as it should be. It serves not merely as aesthetic distraction, but as an affirmation of our shared humanity, a symbol of a brighter future, fueling our hope and inspiring our actions toward a more beautiful world and a fulfillment that lies beyond. Just a really stunning passage there. Can you talk about how you, sort of where that comes from and that logic? Because I think it really summarizes the argument you're making about the relationship between beauty and hope in just a really lovely way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just try. I mean, yeah, a lot of those examples are the things that I mentioned in the piece, and I was trying to figure out what is the common thread that connects them. The idea of beauty for me has just been a very recent kind of object of fascination, and it started out with actually a course on protest movements, it's on social movements and protest and so on. And we were reading the literature. This is about, maybe 15 years ago now, reading the literature that pointed so much to negative emotional shocks as being the sort of impetus, so moral outrage, right, as being the sort of driving force behind social movements. And it struck me that there has to be a flip side to that there has to be the outrage is because of the deprivation of something. There has to be something that is beautiful, a sort of a positive force that's driving people, not just a negative one. And I was then led to Elaine Scarry's book on beauty and justice, which is really a short, provocative essay on how encountering symmetry and so on in nature, she argues is at the root of our desire for justice. I don't know if I entirely buy her argument, but it is a provocative one. Like Nazis loved beauty, right? So not every encounter with beauty will make you a just person, but it seemed to be that there's something there that in the encounter with beauty, and I started to recognize this in my own life as I became more attentive to it, that there were experience I had, as a kid who, I was struggling with my mother's psychotic episode. So when I was 8 years old, she suddenly became, schizophrenic and started, hallucinating and so on. And it was quite shocking. And I was dealing with just sort of, typical challenges of going through school as a kid. And I found these experiences of beauty to be the sort of the thing that I looked forward to. They were bright spots in the day. And there were simple things like, a samosa, which is the kind of pastry that you get as street food we'd get in our school canteen. Or we used to go to the Hindu temple from time to time, and we would get these offerings, these sweets that were intensely sweet. And so that it was the kind of simple pleasures of these things that they were very, really profound at the same time. And then for me, they seemed to convey some kind of promise from reality that there's more, that beyond not everything is as gloomy as it looks. I don't know how attentive I was to that as a kid, but these things would linger with me, and they would raise these questions as to why if life is so miserable and I am kind of doomed, I had a sort of fatalistic streak, then how is it that so these experiences of beauty created a sense of doubt in the face of despair, in the face of in the injustice of life that I perceived myself to be living against. And then I realized the more I could be attentive to that beauty, the more I could recognize it's actually everywhere. And there is the promise being conveyed that is all around us. But and then there's a choice as to whether or not you recognize that, right? There's a choice as to whether you dismiss that as trivial and unimportant, or whether you see it as pointing to something more. And I think so. I became a Christian when I was a teenager, and when I was 18, and that really was, for me, the key to unlock the ability to connect beauty and hope. But I don't want to rule out the possibility that someone could do it without that.
Great. There's a passage that I just loved, and it's about this example of a mayor in an Albanian city who introduced color. And as a sort of color junkie, and really as someone who finds color motivating in my daily life, I found it very provocative. But the question I had was, when I think of color in my own life, I think of joy. Right. So, and I see this as moments of joy through my day. how do you connect the joy and that emotive response
Yeah.
to a gray Albanian city suddenly having orange buildings,
Yeah.
brightly
Yeah.
colored things? How do you connect the joy of that to the hope of that?
Yeah, you know, the example comes from the book Joyful by Ingrid Fetell-Lee, and she's a designer. I think I don't know if she still works at IDEA or she used to, but I think she starts the book with the example of Eddie Rama, who was the mayor of Tirana, and you know, as they were coming out of communist rule, he has this artistic background and sees the gloomy city that he's in and wants to do something to change things, and he paints this building bright orange, and you know, it stops the traffic and people get really confused and they don't know what to make of it. And he sends out this survey sort of asking people, you know, do you like it and should I stop? And the response to whether people liked it was quite divided. Half the people liked it and half didn't, but almost nobody wanted him to stop doing that. So he started just painting these things. And so I think, yeah, that encounter with brightness, with color, again, it sounds so trivial, right? I mean, it sounds like, gosh, you know, we're talking about profound injustice and people's lives are at stake. And what are you talking about color? I mean, it seems so stupid. And yet it does something to us, you know, and you know, it did transform that city because it gave them that sense that there's more, that there's hope, that there's some way out of the situation they're in. And even to the point that, you know, I give the example in the book that he sees shopkeepers who had, you know, put shutters over their windows start to actually replace them with glass, and it's not because they'd started improving the police patrols. It's not because they had started cracking down on crime more. It was just that this confidence that these symbols of joy could exude suggested that, you know what, things are going to get better. So people could be less afraid, right? And you could start to see that. So yeah, I do think encountering beauty creates it can create the sense of joy, and joy, I think, is closely related to hope, particularly in context of suffering, right? I think experiencing joy gives you that sense of confidence that you can reach out towards the future, and there's something there to hold you.
In that articulation, do you think of beauty and its relationship to hope as really an intentional, purpose-driven project that one can pursue to cultivate hope within oneself or within a community?
Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I don't, I mean, because you could get Pollyannish, and you know, like you could really start to sort of see, well, as long as I've got pretty flowers in front of me, I'm, you know, if you're living in one of the kinds of neighborhoods that Lydia is describing, I mean, you know, I don't know whether it's enough, but I think it does play a role. It is energizing. It gives us power. It gives us energy. And we need that in order to act. And your actions may fail. You know, you may fight for justice and lose trying. But it can move you in that direction, right? So it doesn't guarantee success, but I do think it has that power. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think through it a bit. I'd love to hear if there are examples, but I do think it has that power, and I would love for us. I'm starting to teach a course this fall on beauty and society. Never taught it before, and I do want my students to cultivate a kind of practice of attentiveness to beauty, and I would love to see if it creates some kind of resilience or sense of hope among them. So I don't know yet.
Okay, great.
Can I ask? Yeah, so I've been reading a lot of Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermons in the last few weeks, kind of sort of all in the same vein. And what's really struck me is the commitment to nonviolence, which maybe that sort of moral commitment could be argued as a commitment to beauty. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is, again, being Pollyannish, but it strikes me that to do it well is so difficult. I remember Michelle Obama saying, you know, when they go low, we go high, kind of thing. And, you know, when the police are in your face and violent, what do? You respond with nonviolence. That is a moral beauty that is incredible. And just thinking about protest movements, you know, being in New York during George Floyd, it was pretty crazy. And what would it look like to start a movement from a place of moral beauty? And how does that confer a different kind of hope? Anyway, I throw that out there to both of my colleagues. I don't know what to do.
There was a Union Theological Seminary student who did his summer internship at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Dr. King was an assistant pastor under his dad, his father, when he was leading the SCLC. So a lot of his sort of daily operations ran out of his office at the church. And this guy told this story of he was there all summer. He was involved in all sorts of stuff, and people in Atlanta sort of gathered that this white guy was collaborating with the black folks over at the church. And so on his way in one day, this gang of young white guys sort of harassed him and roughed him up, and he got away. But anyway, he'd experienced a bit of harassment because of his involvement in this. And he realized he had just no resources to deal with this. I mean, he was just undone by it. And so he stumbles into Dr. King's office and says, how in the world do you deal with this? These people are chasing me on the way to work just because I'm doing what I think is right. And he recalled that Dr. King took him very seriously. He realized as he was answering it that he had really had to grapple with this. And he even said that while he was sitting there in silence, sort of thinking about a response to him, the secretary called in and said the Justice Department was on the phone. And Dr. King said, tell them to wait. I'll be there in a minute. And he said, finally, he looked at him and said, I think what I've learned is that you have to reach deep down inside of yourself and find that thing that that we're talking about, right? What is that thing that keeps you moving forward? What is that thing that sort of is the source of your hope? And obviously for Dr. King, that was deeply connected to his faith and to that church that he had grown up in, and to the beauty that was cultivated there, in the face of oppression. I mean, Black preaching has an incredible commitment to beauty. The songs in that tradition think of somebody like Aretha Franklin, who's a master of that tradition. You realize there's just an incredible devotion to beauty in the midst of that. And that story comes to mind because I feel like that was what he said. He said, you got to find that thing deep down inside of you. And, in the face of these challenges that are going to come, this violence that is going to, be the reaction to an insistence for change. He said, that's the source of nonviolence, right? That hope inside of you is the source. Yeah.
Great. So Jonathan, I'd like to turn to you in a particular passage that I think picks up well on what you're saying. It's when we choose to live in the face of evil with confidence that life is stronger than death, we can live in the power that created the universe, the love that moves the sun and other stars. Our hope isn't that we have the power to change anyone or any system, rather that we can live here and now in the way of truth. How do you think about a notion of truth in connection to hope?
Well, I was reflecting, my essay here is not very theoretical. It's just kind of narrative. I'm just talking about, my own journey over the last couple of decades, and the way that, our lived experience becomes a real challenge to hope, especially if we're trying to confront the injustice of the world. And so, I was thinking there about, in terms of the connection between truth and hope, the way that sort of that conviction that is at our center, where, whatever informs that, it is the truth that we believe about the way the world is or it ought to be, always is what I think animates our capacity to go on. Now, I think what we've been saying here about habits is really important, and I think Aquinas was right that your lived truth is never so much about sort of what you believe in your best reflective moments, but what you've actually sort of made your like, everybody thinks that it's, generally good to get your cardio in, but if you don't actually figure out some way to, make your movement part of your life, then you're sort of you have a truth that's not very effective in terms of shaping a practice of hope. And I think that's true in most of reality. So I guess what I was trying to reflect on is just the way that my own practice of trying to pursue hope in the world has, I think, clarified for me what truths in my own tradition are important in terms of informing the way I live every day.
Hey, thank you for that. Lydia, I want to turn to a couple of pieces you have. I think they resonate some, as you said, with Norman Wordsworth's notion of practice. And you write, if you want to be a person of hope, you have to practice it. It is not enough to wait passively for the appetite of hope to come upon you. If you want to hope in the face of death, you have to repeat it continually till it becomes part of your nature. So when you think of that, how do you actually practice hope? Jonathan talked about cardio. I think we all have a sense of, yeah, if we need to get our cardio in, what that looks like. Hope feels more ephemeral. How do we practice it?
Yeah, so this gets to sort of the bigger genre of my couple of books, which sort of looks to the tradition of the ars moriendi, or the art of dying genre of literature that developed during the aftermath of the bubonic plague in the mid-1300s. And essentially it was a series of handbooks on the preparation for death, meant to be used and relied upon by the laity in the context of their communities. So these really were, sort of non-clergy empowerment books to think about what it means to live and die well. But sort of central to this genre of literature is that dying well is intimately tied to living well. So you're not a person who dies in hope and with patience and generosity if you have not made patience and generosity and hope a habit over the course of your lifetime. It's very rare sort of to master these kinds of virtues when you're dying if they haven't been a part of your living. So what does that look like? I mean, so I've actually been kind of testing it out in the last year, partly with my students as we've been reading about hope. But sort of the exercise is something like this, X, Y, and Z happened, and it's devastating, and everyone's depressed and down. And so then I say, okay, so how do we hope going forward? And just turn it into a conversation starter with the students, with my team here in the Ethics Center at Columbia. What does it mean to hope in this circumstance? We received some bad news in the last year as a center, and immediately my response was, okay, so where do we find hope now? What does hope look like for us moving forward? And to actually make that a practice, to turn the conversation, because I think it's far too easy for us, again, wallow in despair, to sort of hang out in that negative space. But what does it mean to think differently about the adversity? And there's adversity all the time. So really then this should give us many, many opportunities to engage in cardio, right? It's not just the one exercise a day, first thing in the morning, last thing at night. It's your sort of every hour there's an opportunity to do 5 minutes of cardio, and to really make that a habit, I think helps us then become people who hope, communities who hope, collectives who hope, and sort of changes the way we live then. And then of course the way we die.
So in your experience with your team and with your students, do you find that people get better at hope or at hoping? That's a practice that becomes more natural, more intuitive, easier? Is it like cardio? The more you do it, the more it becomes part of who you are, the easier, if you will, that it becomes?
Sure. I mean, that's the argument for the virtues in general, right? So I do think that's the case. I mean, I have teenage kids, and gratitude is something we try to practice. And it's amazing how teenagers can really get out of practice with gratitude. But when you make it a practice, right, before every meal, before bed at night, what are we thankful for? What are we thankful for? When there's bad news, how are we thankful? So that's been something we've been doing at home. But I certainly think that all of these virtues, the more we practice them, the more they're part of the conversation. I will say, so many of our medical students have zero sort of moral formation. They're not formed in religious traditions. They're sort of kind of good consumers of Western culture, which doesn't then give them much equipping to think about what it means to make. I mean, the language of virtue is so arcane, right? Who talks about virtue if you haven't had sort of somewhat of either a classical or a religious education, especially if you're in this sort of STEM disciplines, right? No talk of virtue. So to bring this language into medical professional formation has been really, really fascinating, a lot of fun. The students are so hungry for it. The idea that we might flourish best in community. Some of our students have never thought about the possibility of needing community in order to flourish. They've grown up in isolation. It's been about themselves. They're only children. They grew up in China. There's sort of all of these different scenarios out there. Why would one need community? Does one really need community, Dr. Dugdale, in order to flourish? So I think the more we bring these elements that I think those of us in the space of virtue understand to be integral to the good life, right? To flourishing, human flourishing, the more we bring this into sort of educational spaces, students are hungry for it. They're looking for something deeper. Yes, and certainly making hope a habit, then it continues to sustain us, or we can hope for one another when particular individuals in the community are unable to hope.
Okay. Something for each of you. So you're all educators of a sort. In Wake professor and director of leadership and character program, Michael Lamb's piece, he notes the dangers of despair and benefits of hope. And Lydia, you've talked about this in your students. He goes on to detail how hope is associated with a greater sense of meaning in life, lower levels of anxiety, depression, more productivity, and even increased academic achievement. He notes that hope is essential to human flourishing. Lydia's talked a little bit about this, but Brandon and Jonathan, right? Can you teach hope? Do you teach hope? Are there better and worse ways to do that work with students or with communities that you engage?
Sorry, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Jonathan, why don't you?
I won't forget what I'm saying. Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I every year I teach a course on social problems. It's a very depressing course, as students call it, and because we go through, a series of 5 or 6 issues in depth, looking at the way in which the prison system has become the default warehouse for the severely mentally ill in this country, how eviction causes poverty, gang violence in Central America, bonded labor, and its relation to the caste system in South Asia and so on. And students leave, for a number of times when I taught this course, they would constantly say, this is so depressing. There's got to be, can you give us some signs of hope? And we would scatter, in each of these units, some exemplars of people who are trying to address such issues. People like Jonathan, the kind of work that you're doing, and we try to find, case studies, but students didn't find that sufficient. And recently, something I've started doing is doing these like design thinking workshops. So design thinking is something that comes out of the Stanford D School, and it's a peculiar methodology for developing innovation in the face of sticky problems or wicked problems that aren't easy to solve. And so I used to do this sort of mainly for consulting work. And I said, why don't I bring this in the classroom and see if we can tackle some of these issues? And it was incredible to see students working on these things, with like Post-it notes. It's kind of cheesy, and doing these lateral thinking exercises. But each of them would come up in their groups with some concrete solution that they say, we could implement this. And it's not going to solve the problem, but it moves us forward. And so doing that actually created more of a sense of hope, that sense of, if we come together and try to really think through this and work on it together, that we can actually, try to create something that, who knows if these initiatives would actually be implemented anywhere, but the possibility that I can do something was really, I thought, a huge change in the the sentiment of the class, and the responses I got to it were really incredible. And so I keep doing it going forward, but that was one small thing where you can give people practically an ability to try to reimagine the future and construct some kind of solution, even if it's not clear how that'd be implemented. But I think that does something, right? Like seeing that, wow, we can come together and create something that we individually couldn't have imagined, but putting our heads together and working through it, something emerges that's greater than the product of any mind, and maybe there's some possibility that this could work in the world. So it's one small example.
So one question.
Can I just ask, Suzanne, do you think that it suggests a movement away from exemplars? Because sort of historically, the exemplar has been the way we sort of see our way through. But if your students are saying we need to be able to workshop the problem, and we don't want to hear Jonathan's story, or Jonathan's story doesn't tell us how to fix this right now. I'm just curious how you make sense of it.
Yeah. So I think it was something, it was not that they didn't want to hear it, they wanted the exemplars, but they didn't. It was one of those things where that's okay, looks like I can see how that works over there, but how do I know that? And this is a fundamental sort of public policy insight, right? Solution A in context X may not work in context Y because the conditions that were required for it to work may not be present, right? So I think it was something of that sort where maybe replicating a model like Jonathan's isn't necessarily the way to go. Maybe what you need is to use the logic of inspiration and say, all right, I can see this. I want to think through, like, what were the conditions that were available there, and maybe some other similar conditions could work in another context to produce something that's not exactly like, it's not replicating what he's doing, but the inspiration is important, but I don't think replication is necessarily the only way students want to think about it, it seems. This is just my class. I don't know, it could be different elsewhere.
I love how what you're talking about is a communal engagement of the challenge. Because that's been my own thought in terms of how to teach this. When I engage with young, sort of isolated people who are tempted by despair, one of the things I offer is an invitation for them to attend funerals, because young people don't go to many funerals. But I've, been, as I mentioned, a pastor since I was a teenager, so I've been doing funerals all my life. And one of the things that happens in funerals, and again, this is particular to traditions, but lots of funerals nowadays have lots of mixed traditions within them, is that you find a community of people who are grieving the loss of someone, but also each of them and collectively trying to figure out what their hope is for going forward, right? It's a practice through which people have tried to sustain hope in the face of death. And I think it's just another example of the kind of scenario that you're creating in the classroom. You're saying we all are focused on this challenge. You're going to die. Now, how are we going to make sense of that in terms of our own lives? And you even at funerals you have the person is not always an exemplar, but you have one individual whose life is on display, and everybody's sort of in conversation with that, right? How do I make sense of my own life in light of the way this person lived their life?
So I want to circle back to this notion of exemplars, and two questions for you, Brandon. One, do you explicitly use the word hope in these conversations? Right. So is that part of the conversation? And the other one has to do with Michael Lamb talks about the importance of exemplars in his piece. He also talks about the importance of instructors, educators being exemplars themselves and coming to an understanding of the way they think about hope. Is your way of being ever part of the conversation, and or do you explicitly talk about hope in the context of these social problems?
I don't know, to be honest. I'm not sure. I may casually use the word perhaps, but I mean, I do think that I mean, part of what we're trying to get at is the intractability of these problems and the ways in which the policies that are tried to address these issues often end up making things worse. So one of the big threads through that course is the unintended consequences of policies and how so many of the problems we're dealing with were actually amplified by well-intentioned efforts to solve those problems. So I do think it can create a sense of despair, and I think that's what students are really struggling with, is seeing example after example of like, okay, we're going to try to fix this, and whoops, it creates these side effects, and that, so I do think that we are, again, showing the exemplars is a way to, for each of these units we have really good examples of people who are, like, just offhand, the example of gang violence, we have, Father Greg Boyle and Homeboy Industries in LA that a lot of people are familiar with, right? And seeing the fantastic work that they're doing. So I think you can see in the stories and of people who are impacted by these organizations very clearly a sense of hope that shines through. Maybe not like hope for solving the whole problem, but hope for the individuals who are being impacted by that organization. I think that comes through. In my own case of trying to sort of be an exemplar myself, I mean, I think just simply the fact that I'm doing research on this, I think is, I make connections between, say, my mother's mental illness and why I've done research on mental health, and so a lot of these issues, I think, I draw connections to my own life, but I'm not sure, am I an exemplar of hope for my students? I don't know. I'm not really sure how I would assess that.
How about you, Jonathan? So do you explicitly engage in a conversation about hope? You gave the example about bringing folks to funerals.
Well, what I find is that a lot of people come to me asking about hope. So in those contexts, definitely. But then in a broader context, yes, I and not just by myself, but with others, have been raising the question of, can we collectively hope for something better? I think that's always a central question of movement building, and I'm part of the Poor People's Campaign in the United States right now, and this is a movement led by people directly impacted by poverty who are saying, our lives are at stake here, and we believe we can hope for something better. And I think, having spaces and communities where that kind of hope is articulated and where people not only sort of have a vision for what that could be, but say, and we could get here through these steps. Now, as Brandon noted, you have to be self-critical. You have to acknowledge that sometimes, the steps you think you're taking might not have the consequences that you intend. Nevertheless, I think hope is cultivated by being in those spaces. And so, in a shared and collective way, I'm very much trying to cultivate hope in that work.
Lydia, in your work, you asked Brandon about the question of exemplars. Is that sort of a mode that you would use, or you describe this questioning mode? What is your approach, if you will?
Yeah, we started something a year ago called the Columbia Character Cooperatives, which is taking groups of students who have to write essays and interview to become a part of the cooperative. So they're self-selected, but there's also, they have to put some skin in the game to be selected. And then together with a philosopher and theologian, we have curated a curriculum that is all extracurricular, so sort of adjacent to the formal medical curriculum, and we meet monthly over dinner, these sort of 3-hour dinners where we're discussing the topic that is relevant. So we start by laying a foundation for the virtues. So it's kind of very Aristotelian in many ways, but then move through some of the big questions of community and embodiment and sickness and suffering and harming and being harmed, and then some specific questions specifically related to medicine, such as what is medicine for? And so we do this over the year. In between dinners, we invite the students to one-on-one mentoring sessions. And so they have the possibility of meeting with us every month, actually one-on-one. And so what we found is that not only does this create space for naming virtues, talking about what it means to live a life of virtue, cultivating virtues. It's also building community. And our hope then is that this sort of community will really help strengthen and kind of fortify the students as they continue in their medical training, which, you know, is pretty, it's gotten pretty bad in many ways. And so we've, you know, our first year was a bit of a pilot, and it's been really successful here. So we're expanding it quite significantly this year, insofar as we have resources to try to meet the needs of more students. And so, yeah, actually, we're doing this quite deliberately, Suzanne.
Great. Before we turn to audience questions, I want to ask you each about a book. So one of the things we asked each author was to suggest just a book to the readers of the issue. And so, Jonathan, why don't you share the book you suggested and why, and we can in turn turn to each of you.
Well, the book I had suggested is a published sermon. There aren't many sermons published anymore, but I think this one is especially good in terms of articulating a vision for that shared hope that so many people need in this moment. And it comes out of this work I mentioned with the Poor People's Campaign. It's a sermon that the Reverend William Barber delivered at the National Cathedral. We Are Called to Be a Movement, it's called.
Great. How about you, Lydia?
Yes, I recommended Radical Hope by Jonathan Lear, not knowing that he was going to be part of this special issue. But that book has been a great conversation piece with my students. And actually, we had a colloquium on it that Jonathan attended. And so it's, for those who don't know, it's the story of the Crow people and how in the sort of face of demise of their civilization as they understood it, Radical Hope enabled them to reimagine what some of the core concepts of their culture could be in a completely new sort of civilization. And you know, partly we're talking all the time about the collapse of healthcare, and medicine's a disaster, and everybody has horror stories. And so what does it look like to practice medicine, to be a good practitioner when the profession as we understand it might be facing imminent demise? Maybe not, maybe we're overstating things, but then more broadly, right, with all of the cultural shifts and young people not being able to make sense of the world in which they find themselves, how do we then equip one another to move forward? And so I just have loved engaging Jonathan Lear's book, Radical Hope.
Great. How about you, Brandon?
Yeah, the book I recommended was Luke Burgess's book Wanting, which is about desire, and it's an accessible introduction to René Girard's theory of mimetic desire, which might seem kind of odd for this issue, but so mimetic desire is this idea that our desires are not our own; they're borrowed. That we desire things because other people desire them, and I think that that hope can be mimetic, can be contagious. I mean, and so I think. I don't want to dismiss exemplarity, because I think that when you see exemplars, but that can inspire us. But I think we need exemplars not only of people who are instantiating hope, but those who desire hope. Because if we borrow the desires of other people, then we need to be surrounded by others who desire hope, right? So I think there's something there for us to think about.
That's great. I like that notion of mimetic, the process there. So I want to open it up to some of the audience questions. And I'm going to start with this one. The COVID-19 pandemic made everyone aware of the need of hope in everyday life. Do you think the pandemic ultimately made us more hopeful, or are we still trying to recover our hope for the future? And there was a piece in the volume about the notion of hope in the pandemic. But anyone have a thought there about the pandemic's role?
My observation has been, and this is anecdotal, but that it doesn't necessarily make people more hopeful, but I do think that it unveiled the false hope that a lot of people had, both in terms of just like the practice of their daily life, but also the sort of, false notion that a lot of people have that most things work okay. We live in the, 21st century, and the center of power. It seems like most things work. I think that was unveiled by the, and that makes me think of, what James Baldwin said, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so I do think that people have had to face the problems that are real, and that means despair is a real option. But when you face the problems, hope is a real option too.
Great. Anybody else on that one?
Yeah, I'm not struck that as much changed as maybe I would have thought, especially publishing a book on death at the beginning of the pandemic. My sense was that a lot of people were living, so there were people for whom precarity became a reality in ways that it hadn't before, to what you're saying, Jonathan. And I think that's especially true for older folks. Older folks are now saying, oh my goodness, I'm the demographic that could be killed by COVID. Let me get my stuff in order. And I saw that a lot. For younger people, and I mean under 70, I would say, there's a real sense of just waiting for things to get back to normal. And when you're always waiting for things to get back to normal, you're not then practicing habits that will help you endure and indeed flourish in adversity. You're sort of put life on hold. So I think there were a lot of people who just put life on hold and then were waiting to book that vacation or get home and see family or whatever it was. So the people who in a sense embraced the precarity anew and then figured out how to flourish in light of that precarity, probably then ended up being the ones who cultivated hope the most.
Yeah, I like that notion, because I think it relates to sort of your notion of the practice of it, but also of this notion of how to live well being really important in the face of this catastrophe and the possibility of death. So super interesting. Another question. It seems so many in leadership positions these days are using the veneer of Christianity to point not to Christ, but to some sort of political ideology. How do we as individuals deal with this, push back against these forces that even threaten our hope of a free society? Well, that's a doozy. Any takers?
That's tough. I mean, I think being surrounded by people who don't give in to this is important, right? I mean, I think that this is a lot of our again going to that idea of mimetic desire. I think if you're surrounded by people who give in to despair, that is a problem. And so I think there are choices to be made as to whether you want to practice living in hope or whether you want to embrace despair.
I'd add to that since the January 6th insurrection, there's been considerable more public attention to the sociological research on white Christian nationalism, which is a way of naming, I think, what this questioner is getting at, the way that Christian faith is used to prop up a sort of authoritarian political vision. And well, I did a book on this for Christians, for people who were in the Christian community a few years ago, called Revolution of Values, and spent some time sort of looking at how long this Christian nationalism has had an influence on the church in America, which is essentially since there has been a church in America. So in some ways, it's interesting in that it there's more awareness of this, even though it has been influencing communities for a long time. So again, it's one of these situations where I feel like the fact that people now can name it or recognize it sort of gives you the opportunity to decide how you're going to respond to it. And I am encouraged by both the Christians who are organizing against Christian nationalism. There's actually a movement called Christians Against Christian Nationalism that you can learn more about. But also, by the way, folks of all different stripes and sort of traditions and are recognizing this as a threat to democracy. And so are trying to build coalitions to say, we're going to resist this vision that sort of you have to be a good white Christian to be a good American in order to try to build a political coalition that could fulfill the promises of the democratic experiment.
Great. Next,
I think that if I could add, it does raise an interesting question as to hope for whom, right? Because there are for the Christian nationalists, their hope is for a world in which people like us can thrive. You know, to hell with the rest of them, right? Versus a hope for a kind of pluralistic democracy, which some might see as threatening to, you know, my way of life and the hope for my family is threatened by a kind of pluralism, right? Which so I think it does raise some tricky questions as to how we think about hope and for whom is it, who is included in that, right?
Yeah, when I talk to Christians about this, I say, well, you know, you do have to acknowledge that Jesus was quite concerned in the Gospels about a kind of religious nationalism that said, you know, for us, you know, but that's not what Jesus was for. The religious nationalists of his day are the people who took him out.
This next question, I think, picks up on some of these same themes. A lack of hope can undermine the kinds of things that go into creating a better world, having and raising children, creating and strengthening our institutions, and protecting the environment. What do you think the role of hope is in building for the next generation?
Yeah, this is where I'm really struck by Iris Murdoch and her conception of the good. And if Aquinas is right that hope is a movement towards an arduous good, right, difficult to attain, but then there's this question of pluralism, whether you believe in God, whether you believe in the Christian God. And Murdoch gives us this, you know, Murdoch was a bit nervous about God, she definitely had religion in her background, but rejected it and really clung to this idea of the supreme good. And I think if we were to take that sort of in the abstract and to say, I'm a bit nervous about making hopes too specific. I would rather have, right, because if I hope, you know, a particular candidate is elected and I put all of my hope in that, and that candidate is not elected, what am I left with, right? But if I can hope that whoever is elected, right, that the political processes will work for the common good or will work toward a greater good, even if I'm not quite sure what that means, right? Murdoch's notion of the good is something that is supreme, that we can work towards. She has this image of the painter. The painter is painting version after version of the painting, sort of yearning, sort of feeling, thinking. I liked your language, Jonathan, of going out into the woods and listening. I imagine the painter sort of, you know, trying to see as he or she paints, what is this good that will be realized? And I think that's a wonderful conception of hope. So this idea then, for whether it's children or the environment or, you know, democracy, that we can yearn, commit to, lean into this good that will be realized, even if it's not what we would expect, not what we could name now. I think that is the role for hope. That's the habit that I would like my students, myself, to cultivate as we look to the future.
Great. Next question. There is research that suggests we are often overconfident, both in our own abilities and that everything will ultimately work out. Is this confidence the same as hope, or is there more to hope than just thinking things will go well? I'm thinking that's optimism, but I don't know what others think.
Yeah, or presumption, right? So is it Aquinas? Is it Aquinas? I don't know. You guys know more than I do, but you know, hope is the mean between despair or hopelessness, right, and presumption, which I would define as false hope. And so if you have a sort of a rightly oriented confidence, a confidence that is not totally self-referential, but maybe acknowledges circumstance, acknowledges resources, acknowledges all these things, I think a rightly oriented confidence can be appropriate. A leader of a company, a professor in a classroom needs a certain amount of rightly oriented confidence. However, when that confidence is disordered, is sort of perversely ordered, then that could be a presumption, which also then is not hope. It gets away from hope. But I don't know what Brandon or Jonathan would think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of, you know, St. Paul's, you know, conviction that all things will work together for the good for those who love God. And it's an interesting sort of thing, right? Which is ultimately we don't decide what that good is. But there is a good that you can expect if you love God, right? So there's a caveat there, right? Which is you trust in someone else, and that could be you could have a naturalistic sort of view of that, right? You can think of just simply nature has its own knowledge and is resilient, and so if you're despairing at the fate of the planet, well, I mean, there's a lot of research to suggest, you know what, actually, nature will find a way. In spite of our attempts to destroy it, right? So, which again, I think there is a danger of that becoming presumption, but there's also, I think, ways in which we can think about, the outcome is not something that we can hope in a concrete way and say this is what's going to happen. But I think we could be confident in sort of, the good resulting in some way.
Yeah, I think this is one way of naming the experience of grace in our lives. This is how I talk to my kids about these things. There are a great many things, and I think as religious people in particular, I'm speaking about myself here, I have to be conscious of the way that all religious traditions are tempted to say more than we know. I learned in the study of theology that's actually the main temptation of theology, to say more than you know. So my kids often ask me these questions about, what's going to happen, after we die, or after the sort of beyond the things that we know. And I always tell them, I don't know, but my experience of grace tells me that, everything that I've been able to enjoy was a gift. So I'm kind of trusting that gift to continue beyond what I know.
And that might be a good, that's certainly a good check on confidence. I was thinking when Brandon was talking also about humility, right? So for those who may not relate to the language of grace, sort of God's unmerited favor toward us, right? Maybe the idea that appropriately ordered confidence is tempered by humility. There's always things we don't know. There's always someone smarter in the room than we are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah.
Great. One final question before we wrap up. There's widespread belief that the world is in moral decline. The research on this topic is interesting because it shows that generation after generation, people believe the world is in moral decline, even though many things seem to be improving and moving forward. Is there a relationship between hope and moral progress? Is it harder to hope when you think the world is in a moral free fall?
Well, I think our assessment of these things are always relative, right? So I think we are right to be outraged, at inequality in our world today, even if, the person who lives on $2 a day may have access to some things that people 1,000 years ago could have never imagined. Both of those things can be true. But, we make sense of our world, relative to what we know. And so I don't know if I have any big declarations about sort of, the arc of moral progress. I think what's been more important to me is sort of how do we negotiate hope and the possibility of change in light of the circumstances that are before us.
I'm just thinking, Jonathan, as you say that, of a particular quote in your piece where you say, there is nothing inherently redemptive about suffering itself. Injustice is evil, and it is sustained by the banality of our easy acceptance that the way things are is the way things have to be. And I think this is sort of an interesting thought that, right, it's about the work of moving toward justice and the way that hope enables that work. to flourish and engage. So as we're wrapping up, I just want to see, does anybody have any final thoughts for the audience? This has been just a fantastic conversation. But does anybody want the last word?
Well, I'll just say thank you to all of you, but thanks also to you and the center there for taking on this issue, because as we've all said, it's something very much on people's minds. So grateful for the space to have this conversation.
Absolutely. And if no one else has anything, I just want to thank you all and everybody who joined us today. This was just a fantastic conversation. And I really encourage everybody to read your pieces. They're really inspiring, moving, and motivating in the best of ways. I also want to announce that Lori Patton, president of Middlebury College, will be joining us on Monday, September 18th, talking about the calling of higher education. And so with that, thank you all so much. This was just great fun. And again, truly inspiring.